What a challenge the gospel gives us, especially these last several weeks when we've been listening to the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5 of Matthew. It actually began way last Advent, on the second and third Sunday of Advent. And then we went into the Christmas season, and now back to ordinary time, and we're back to the Sermon on the Mount. It's really the blueprint of a Christian, a blueprint of a Catholic. And boy, is it challenging. None of us will ever live up to that because we are not perfect as the Father is perfect. But we are called to perfection, or called at least to do the best we can. And in the society in which we live today, that's about all we can do the best we can, because the culture in which we live is so different from the demands of the gospel that it almost seems that the gospel is silliness, almost impossible to even dream of doing. A couple weeks ago, we listened to the Beatitudes. On the fifth Sunday, we listened to Christ saying, "You are the salt of the world. You are the light of the world." Last weekend, it was about righteousness. You need to be more righteous than the Pharisees, or you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And today, the continuation is all about revenge. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, love your enemies. That probably counts most of us out, huh? But we try. We do the best we can. Every time I proclaim this gospel, I think of a story, the story of a man who one late night, he was a truck driver, he pulled into a roadside watering hole for some food and some drink and some relaxation. As he was eating, three tough-looking, hard-as-nails motorcyclists roared up to the inn and then roared inside and up to the bar. The place grew quiet. You could feel the tension in the air. For some reason, they spotted the truck driver and used him as the target of their meanness. One man shook salt and pepper on his head. One of them took a piece of apple pie and dropped it on the floor where he crushed it under his boot. The third managed to knock over his coffee, causing it to spill on the man's trousers. The truck driver got up. He said nothing. He walked to the cashier. He paid his bill and made his exit. "That dude sure isn't much of a fighter," sneered one of the three cyclists. The waiter behind the counter peered out the window onto the dark parking lot and replied, "He's not much of a driver either." He just ran over 3 motorcycles. A classical story about revenge, huh? What did you think? Keep that thought for a moment. What would have your reaction been? Where in our society would that fall? But first of all, I'd like to mention a little bit more about Unbound. Unbound, as I mentioned, was started back in 1981 by 5 lay people like yourselves. And all about connecting a child in need, finding a sponsor for a child in need, that is for his education, and then making it a reality, because what is so impossible to do on a normal basis, because we don't know any kids personally to be able to do that, we make the invisible child visible to you today, and the opportunity to step into that life and transform this child. Our world office is located in Kansas City, and from Kansas City, we extend out to 20 developing countries around the world. Those countries then each have their own central office in one of the major cities, and from that central office, then they will reach out to the farthest away regions of the country where we find the poorest of the poor. And there we might be way up in the mountains, as I mentioned, or it might be in the inner city, in the slums, in the most desperate areas where children simply cannot and don't have the recourses for an education. For instance, when I was in El Salvador recently, and I visited one of the areas way up in the mountains where we have a lot of kids sponsored. It took us over 4 hours in the minibus to get to a little village, and from there, another half hour in the back of a cattle truck till we finally reached the end of the road. And there we were met by literally a couple hundred children, many of who are sponsored, and therefore they came to greet us and give us thanks and hugs and everything to express their gratitude. Also in the city of Santa Ana, when they have spent a day walking along some abandoned railroad tracks that just go on and on and on and on as far as the eye can see. And on either embankment of the tracks, there are hundreds and hundreds of tin shacks. And in these tin shacks live many hundreds of children, some of whom are sponsored and now are in school, but most of whom are simply doing nothing, and they get caught up in child labor and never have an opportunity, an education or a life. And so what we do is reach out to these people. This is what Lent is really about, and Pope Francis reminds us of this every day. In fact, his message this year for Lent is a time of conversion, a time to deepen our faith, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And he says, faith finds expression in concrete everyday actions meant to help our neighbors in body and spirit. Feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, welcoming strangers, offering instruction, giving comfort, on such things will we be judged. And so Pope Francis puts it very clearly. We are not only called to, but by baptism obliged to reach out to those who are in desperate need. The 20 countries that I mentioned are countries like Africa. We have 4 countries in Africa where we have centers. All of India, all of the Philippines, most of South America, all of Central America. In each of these places where we have main offices, they reach out to the poorest of the poor. That's the criteria, the poorest of the poor, not just the poor. We have a lot of poor people everywhere, including here in River City, right? But the poorest of the poor are the ones that we reach out to who would not have an opportunity for an education. This all began, as I mentioned, 36 years ago by one of the 5 founders of Unbound, Bob Henson. He just died recently. He's the last of the original founders. Bob began in Bogota, Colombia. He met a little girl who wanted to go to school but couldn't afford it. And so he made a commitment to her personally. He said, I will sponsor you for your education through grade school, through high school, through college, as long as you're in school. He makes a pledge to do that. Now she graduated from the University of Bogota. She's a very 40-some-year-old successful businesswoman. But it all began because Bob Henson entered her life and said, I will help you personally with your education. And so the other founders began to sponsor. Then they had 5 kids sponsored. Then pretty soon they had 100 kids, then 200 kids, then 2,000 kids. Today we have 310,000 children in these 20 countries who are sponsored for their education by people like you and I. People with a compassionate heart, so lacking at times in our society, but people with a compassionate, loving heart who are willing to reach out and transform the life of a child. But yet that's simply a drop in the bucket. 300,000, there are millions of kids who are not in school. You know, someone asked Mother Teresa once, Mother Teresa, where do we even begin? There are so many needs in the world. And Mother Teresa simply said, one at a time. And so what we do is we connect a person like you, one at a time, with a child who is in need, and through your generosity, transform the life of that child. So what we do is unbind people from the cycle of poverty through their no fault of their own into which they were born. Unbind them. That's where unbound comes from. But it's nothing all that dramatic. It's not like what Jesus said to Lazarus, come out, unbind him, give him new life. But that's what we do. We give him new life. We give him a new opportunity. And so we do so very simply, very basically by meeting their very basic needs. Things you and I take for granted for. Shoes, for instance. Shoes to walk those mountainous paths or those long railroad tracks. Or maybe food. These kids don't have school lunch programs, so maybe a sandwich to be able to take along with them to school. Or maybe a sandwich for the little tiny sister who can't go to school but needs some food at home. Or maybe for somebody who needs some medical need in the family, maybe a mom or maybe grandpa. For instance, when I was in El Salvador, I went up to these mountains. I made a point to visit a young man named Luis, whose father is dying from cancer, no recourse at all to any treatments. Luis is in college. He's studying to be a lawyer. He's been sponsored now for the last 15 or so years. Luis is the only one in the family of 5 who's in school. The other brothers are working hard labor, $1 a day, and they support Luis in his education. So one in the family gets an education. The little sister is at home, can't go to school. And so I made a point to visit with Luis way up in these mountain paths. He goes to the University of Santa Ana. And so it is how we meet people who are really, really in need, and meet them where they're at. And then the counselor in that area takes care to make sure the child stays in school. Once the child drops out of school, the program's over. He has to get an education. And so it is with connecting you with the opportunity to know and sponsor a child. When you enter the church back there, you probably noticed on the back table a bunch of folders like this, about 30 of them. Each folder has a picture of a child. This particular child, her name is Leslie, she's from Guatemala. And inside you have a profile of who she is, who this child is, what her dreams are, where she wants to go to school, etc. What will happen if you sponsor one of these children is you'll get a new picture of her each year as she grows through her education. A lot of parents, and it's nice when families do it with their children, because they take these pictures and put them right up on their refrigerator along with all their children and grandchildren. And then the kids can write letters, kind of like a pen pal, but oh, so very much more. They become like brother and sister. They become like a godchild to the family. And so she will write you 2 or 3 times a year. You have the opportunity to write a note back to her. It'll be translated from Spanish into English, and it goes on and on. As long as she's in school or you can continue to sponsor, she will get an education. And so this is what we do. We make these completely unknown children from a world visible and known to you, and in the process then give you the opportunity to sponsor. Let me go back to the scriptures for a moment. What was your reaction to the cyclists? I actually won't ask that question. But I suspect that the standard is so high that most of us really couldn't do much but fall into the revenge factor and rejoice and cheer that on. But Jesus says, an eye for an eye? No. I tell you, love your enemies. Say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand over your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go for 2 miles. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn your back on the one. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, it was said. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So what would have Jesus done with these cyclists? If you take the gospel serious, he probably would have simply paid for the cyclists' breakfasts and then walked out silently and left well alone. It's a challenge. Hollywood movies, our political system, our culture goes totally against that whole concept. So we have to be counterculture, and that's what a Catholic is, to really listen to the gospel and to do the best we can, because we aren't perfect and never will be. And so here's how we do it. If you feel called to sponsor a child today, that's your baptismal call that's coming to you, we give you the opportunity. You can sponsor a child or a youth, maybe in high school, who needs to be re-sponsored, or an elder. You know, we're the only group of our kind that also sponsors elderly people. That means somebody 70, 80 years old, in poverty, their children don't have an education, their grandchildren still don't, and so here they are at the end of the life. So what we do is we try to provide dignity to that person for the last few years of his or her life. For instance, when I was in El Salvador walking along these abandoned railroad tracks, all of a sudden I hear the voice of an elderly lady calling out to me. I hear her saying, "Padre, Padre." And so she scrambles up this embankment and she says, "Padre, sabe que anoche fue la primera vez en mi vida que yo dormí en una cama. Last night was the first time in my life that I slept in a bed." I asked her, "Well, how did that happen?" She says, "Well, her sponsor of Unbound sent some extra money to our center. They delivered me a bed yesterday, and last night was the first time in my life I didn't sleep on a mat on the dirt floor." 84 years old. She was like a child at Christmas time. She was so excited. But this is how we enter the lives of people, the elderly, the young, and the children, and even babies who are 1 or 2 years old, and their mother can't afford to even bring the child up. And so we enter the lives of these people. What do we ask? $36 a month. Well, for some people, $36 a month is too much. Can't afford that. But for most of us, I dare say most of us, including myself, will spend that foolishly today alone. We're called maybe $1, $1.25 or so a day. I know that's very cliche these days. Everybody's asking for $1 a day for something or other. But this is to transform the life of a child, $1 a day. Give up a cup of coffee during Lent now, which we're asked to do. Give up a soda pop. Give up something and take that $1 and put it to use to transform the life of a child. I imagine here in Fairmont you have Starbucks, so maybe you can give up a Starbucks one a day and sponsor 3 or 4 kids, huh? It's a matter of how we value life and our own discretion and how we foolishly perhaps spend money. You can do that in a very simple way. By being billed monthly by Unbound for $36. You can do it by automatic bank withdrawal. You can do it by your credit card or debit card. And then you can actually make it an awareness trip and visit the child that you are sponsoring like I did and get to know the child personally and then write letters and keep in communication. Over the years, I've sponsored now 4 people. One young man from the Philippines, he just graduated from trade school, now he's getting a job, and so the sponsorship ends with that. I sponsored 2 young boys from Guatemala, both in grade school. Their fathers work for $1 a day when there's work available. $1 a day. So I give that family $1 a day and I double their income. And what's important by doubling their income is that the child has to stay in school. Because if the father says at a given moment, "You have to now come and pick coffee with me for the next couple months and drop school," he gets dropped from the program. He has to stay in school. and the parents have to make sure that happens. And so what happens then is these children finally get into school, and we keep them out of the child labor system of the world in which we live. You know, there are 130 million children in the world who are working child labor. 8, 9 years old, the age of you guys. They're not in school. They're doing child labor, slave labor. We get those kids in school. We give them a chance. We give them an opportunity. And so that's kind of what we're about. Recently, I began sponsoring an elderly person also. I saw a picture of an elderly guy from Bolivia one Sunday, and I said, I know that guy because I used to work in Bolivia. But no, that was 40 years ago, so he's long gone. But I'm going to sponsor this guy. His name is Felix. Felix is 82 years old. I'm 76. And I just figure, well, we'll just see which one of us goes first, huh? When Felix dies, of course, it's all over with. If I go first, Unbound will continue to sponsor him regardless, simply till the death, till the end of his life, simply by the donations and gifts that people so generously give. And so this is what we're about. Now, the final thing I want to mention is stewardship. Our overhead is very, very low. We don't advertise. You aren't going to get letters in the mail asking for more and more and more. Your information is private between you and Unbound. The past 9 years, Charity Watch International gave Unbound an A+. And we're the only group of our kind that got an A+ from Charity. Or Charity Navigator this year gave us 4 stars, their highest rating, and the only one to get it. And that's because we're so frugal. That's because we don't throw away your money. We really make it count as it needs to be counted. On the back of the folder, I think I mentioned, 92.6% of the money goes to the child in need. So thank you so very much for this opportunity. A special thanks to Father Bierman, because without the invitation of the pastor, we can never get into any parishes and really make this program available to we Catholics who are called in Lent throughout the year in compassion to be concerned about the poor. So thanks again for this opportunity. At the end of the Mass, I'll explain a little bit more exactly how to fill out a sponsorship form so you can go home today being a sponsor of someone in great need. So thank you so very, very much.